It's Levi Brackman here with Truth Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. Before I begin, if you like this podcast, if you like the content which is presented here, click the subscribe button or like it or leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere else. Thank you so much. Now, this is part of my series on Torah portion uncensored. And today we are talking about Yikra or Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus 18, it's a well-known chapter. A lot of people quote it all around the world. Jewish people, Christian people also quote it because this is the chapter that talks about the forbidden marriages. And arguably, one might say that this is one of the chapters that has had the biggest impact on Western society in general. And it is also one of the chapters that has really been under assault, specifically over the last 20 years in the Western world. And it is the chapter of forbidden marriages, the Arayos, which are really the bedrock of Western society, Judeo-Christian values, and it's something which is changing. So it's worth us taking a look at and seeing what the Torah actually says about it and try and decipher what is the Torah really trying to say. Now, it's really, really interesting because the way this starts off in the chapter, it starts off, I'm going to read it inside as I do, V'yidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemer, and God spoke to Moses saying, Daber al Bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, V'amar ta'aleim, and say to them, Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am the God your Lord. So why is this an introduction to the chapter about the forbidden marriages? And just recap what the forbidden marriages are. Well, they say incest is forbidden. So that is pretty obvious. There are very few people who argue today that incest is positive. So one shouldn't marry one's mother, one shouldn't marry one's sister, one shouldn't marry one's father's sister, one shouldn't marry one's mother's sister, one shouldn't marry two sisters. These are things which are still very well accepted in Western society. But in there, it also says that one should not have homosexual sexual relations. So one shouldn't lie with a man like a man would lie with a woman, it says. So that's something which is not well accepted today and is, in general, one would argue that a lot of the biblically inspired morals, sexual morality, has been under assault. Right now, incest is something which is still considered taboo, but a lot of this is still under assault. So I want to see how the Bible introduces these ideas, because I think it's going to be very instructive to us also today in the postmodern era, let's call it. So chapter 18, verse 3, it says, like the acts of the land of Egypt, in other words, like the people in the land of Egypt behave, that you used to live in there, you should not do. And like the acts of the land of Canaan, that I am bringing you there, you should also not do. And in their ways, in their statutes, you should not go. And then it says, this is still the preamble to the laws about forbidden marriages. And it says in verse 4, Pasuk Dalet, as mishpotai tasu, you should do my judgments, and you should guard my statutes, to go in them, Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am God your Lord. Again, it says, I am God your Lord. Then in the 5th verse, it says, and you should guard my statutes, and my judgments, that the person should do them, and you would live with them. Ani Hashem, I am God. So we've got I am God 3 times here, 3 times in the preamble. And then it goes on, in the next verse, it says, Ish, a man, es al kol she'er b'sarei, anyone who is his close relative, his kinsman, lois sikruvu, he should not get close to them, legalos erva, to reveal their nakedness, Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. So that is actually verse 6, chapter 18. And then it goes on to specify all the different forbidden marriages, all the kind of incestuous relationships that are forbidden. We can go on through all the whole chapter, but one should read it oneself. What I really want to focus on is this preamble, these 5 verses of the preamble. So first of all, the question is, why did it say, I am the Lord your God? Why did it have to say this? So first, a little story which is found in the Talmud, which it says, according to Rabbi Acharai, that when Moses told the children of Israel the laws regarding the forbidden marriages, the children of Israel found it very difficult to accept. They actually didn't want to accept it, and they were very greatly distressed by these laws. Why is that? Because this is how they behaved. Incest was common practice back then. Don't forget, it came from Egypt. They were going to Canaan. It seems like the text itself is giving witness to the fact that these were behaviors and mores that were acceptable and practiced in these 2 lands, the land of Egypt, which was a major superpower at the time, and the land of Canaan. So this was also something which the Israelites practiced. And now they were going to have to stop practicing it, and that they found very challenging. So this was a very challenging set of new laws and new mores that the children of Israel were now expected to accept. So let's put that in the background. And it seems to be there's a lot of evidence for this as well in the text. So it's found in the Talmud, but this seems like in the text itself, as I said, it seems to present this. Given this, we might understand why it says, Ani Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. But this is not the only time it says, I am the Lord your God. As Nachmanides, the Ramban, points out, that this is also something which was said when God gave the 10 Commandments. There's a rabbinic explanation which says that what God is trying to tell the Israelites here is that just like you accepted my kingdom on you, just like you makabel malchusai, my kingdom, that now I have dominion over you, now you should also accept gzeirosai, also my decrees, and my decrees are one shouldn't have these incestuous relationships, and one shouldn't also have homosexual behavior. So that is, in this instance at least, the decrees which God is commanding. But I'll point out that when God introduces himself during the 10 Commandments, he says, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt. So when he introduces himself, he's introducing himself as the God who took himself out of the land of Egypt. And I've explained on this podcast that really what that is trying to say is that God is now legitimizing why it is that you should listen to him. Because I am the Lord, who am I? I am the Lord who took you out of Egypt. I am that same God. And therefore, by doing that, I've shown that I am a legitimate God and a God that you should listen to. But here, it doesn't mention that I am the Lord who took you out of Egypt. All it says is, I am the Lord your God. So it's different. The reason for why it says in the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God, is because he's introducing himself in a sense of the first time. Here I'm giving you the Torah, and I'm introducing myself. I want to tell you which God I am and what I've done for you, and therefore what you need to do for me. Here, there is no such thing. All he's saying is, I am the Lord your God. So what is the reason why he's saying, I am the Lord your God here? What is the purpose here for that? So I've seen that there are some who want to argue that the reason for this is because these are a set of moral laws, which the only way one can have real authority or moral laws is by saying it comes from God. Otherwise, why should one keep certain moral laws over other moral laws? Unless you say that it's divine, there is no real authority. There is no real weight to moral laws. As a matter of fact, that is something that I argued in an article that I wrote many, many years ago, that the only reason why one can have real morals and real power to one's morals is because they come from God. The problem with this is that everyone has their own God. Yes, Jews have the God of the Bible, the God of the Hebrew Bible, And then Christians also have the God of the Hebrew Bible, but then also with the New Testament. You have Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims with their own rules. And then other people might come along and say, though, they also heard from God. Well, we would argue as Jews, well, we're the real one. But really, how much power does that really have when one has lots of books which claim to be the word of the Lord? And back in the time when you lived in a very localized place where everyone lived there, only followed one book, one could argue, yes, that comes from God, and therefore that's the authority, and therefore you should listen to it because of that. But in a globalized world where everyone knows everyone else's books, that starts to become a very difficult argument to make, and to say that 1 second is because God said it, therefore you should listen to these moral laws, because someone else is going to come and say, well, we have another book which has, different moral laws. So I would contend that the text is actually trying to convey something different. So we've argued that the mores of the Israelites at the time was to behave in the exact opposite way of these laws. Incest was something which everyone practiced. As a matter of fact, there was a time in history where people married their sisters. People married very close relatives because those were the people they knew, and people wanted to keep wealth and prestige in the family. So if you have a sister, you should marry your sister. As a matter of fact, Moses's parents were brothers and sisters, Amram and Yocheved. And Jacob married two sisters, something which it says specifically that one shouldn't do in chapter 18 of Leviticus. So this was something which they did. And this was something which was widespread and common amongst the Israelites at the time. It was very difficult for them to accept this, as we've mentioned. For them to change their mores, to change their culture, you couldn't just tell them, hey, I've got a better way of doing things. Because if you tell them, hey, I've got a better way of doing things, they're going to want to know, well, why? How do I know this is a better way of doing things? They've never experienced it. Once you've experienced a better way of doing things, then you know it's better. But if you've never experienced a better way of doing things, then you don't know it's better yet. You only know what you know. So if what you don't know, you don't miss. It's difficult to understand the benefit of something, especially when it's behaviors, unless you've actually experienced that. If I tell you there's a better way of doing something, and then I show you what that thing is, then it's much better. But if I don't show you, then, well, I do it my way, and I'm quite happy. Thank you very much. Doing it my way. I don't need to be told a new way of doing things. So the Israelites had a very good way, they thought at least, of behaving. They kept the marriages in the family, and homosexuality was something which was quite normal. It's another way of getting close to another human being. So why not? And that seemed to work for them quite well. As a matter of fact, not only did it work for them, it worked for the Canaanites, and it worked for the Egyptians, and it was quite widespread. So now why are you telling me to change? So in order to get them to change, God had to tell them, I am the Lord your God. It is my authority as God that I'm telling you. And he tells you 3 times, I am God. But he doesn't just leave it at that. He also says, v'chai b'hem, and you should live with them. Now, there's the rabbinic explanation of v'chai b'hem, and you should live with them, means you should live with them and you shouldn't die with them for them. That means that there are certain types of behaviors that if you are forced under the threat of death, you should transgress that behavior or that law rather than actually dying. So that's the way they explain it. To me, and to some of the other commentators, v'chai b'hem really means by behaving this way, you will be able to live. In other words, your life is going to be so much better. You're going to truly live if you follow my statutes and my commandments and my laws. Then you're going to be able to have a much better life. In other words, what God is saying here is that I know something that you might not know right now. And the reason why I know it and you might not know it is because you've never experienced it. But I'm telling you, because I'm God and I know this, that this is a better way of living. This is a better way of having society. This is how you can truly live and you can truly have a solid, much better life if you follow these mores. So not only is the text saying that the authority here comes from God, The text is also giving a reason for these mores. It's a reason for these moral laws, and that is in order that you should live. If you want to have a society which is going to sustain itself and is going to continue throughout the generations, you need to follow these commandments. And as a matter of fact, at the end of the chapter, he says that explicitly. Verse 27, also anshe haaretz asher lifneichem v'tit ma'aretz, because all these disgusting things, all these abominations, the people of the land did this before you, and they contaminated, they made impure the land. V'loi saki aretz eschem b'tamachem oisem kasher koes agoy lifneichem, and in order that the land shouldn't spit you out with your impurity, like it vomited out the nation which was before you, because it says, verse 29, Ki kol asher yaseh mikol ha'te'evos ha'elu v'nichlusu ha'nefashos ha'osos mikerev amo, because anyone who does from these abominations, their souls will be cut off from the nation. So what he's basically saying here is that naturally the land will spit you out. In other words, this kind of behavior is not sustainable. There's an argument what v'chai b'hem means. Some people say it means living in this world. Some people say it means mainly living in the world to come. If you want to merit to the world to come, then you have to keep these mores. But I think the text is saying something much more fundamental here. And that is that if you want a sustainable society, then you have to keep these mores. And if you want a proof for it, well, the people who lived here before, they weren't successful long term. They didn't have a sustainable presence in this land because they didn't follow these moral laws. Now, I want to focus on one more thing here. In the preamble, we have God saying, I'm the Lord your God. I'm coming from divine, godly authority, and I'm giving a reason for it in order you should live by it. Then he goes through all the different forbidden marriages and all the different kind of forbidden sexual behaviors, including homosexuality. And then at the end of it, he says that if you want to sustain yourself in this land, unlike the people who lived here beforehand, which were the Canaanites, they were unsustainable because they behaved this way. But if you want to live in a sustainable way in this land, these are the mores you should follow. Now, again, this is going to be very difficult for someone who's already lived a life of incest, and that's what the society is built around to accept. But I would argue that once we've lived a life already where we have followed these moral principles, now you no longer need to accept this only from the authority of God. Because, as my friend Professor Daniel Reinhold has argued, there is such a thing as a knowledge and an understanding that comes through experiencing something. So before the Israelites had experienced it, they just had to revert to divine authority to say this is better. But once you've experienced it, you've lived with these morals. That lived experience will give you insight into why this life is better. And now we can start explaining it. So I want to focus on a few explanations, just a couple which I've thought about. First of all, something which we who've lived in the West understand quite well, and that is the demarcation of different boundaries between different things. So we have private property and we have public property. We have my personal property, and then we have someone else's personal property. So not everything belongs to everybody. If you live in a world of Marxism or communism, then no one really has any private property. But in the Western world, people have private property. I can own things. And therefore, there are boundaries. And the Torah is very much focused on this idea of what is mine and what isn't mine. And there's all kinds of laws. What if I lose something and someone else finds it? Do they have to return it? There's all different kinds of laws about how one should do business and how one shouldn't cheat in business. And also, according to the Bible, one shouldn't take interest, etc. There are all these kind of laws associated with business and private property. This is mine and it's not yours. This is yours, it's not mine. And then how does one transfer property, etc. So there's all these different kinds of laws which demarcate the boundaries between different things. When you go all the way to the left, for example, in Marxism and communism, there are no boundaries. But the Torah believes in boundaries. And one might argue that one of the things that the Torah is coming to teach us are boundaries themselves. And I would argue that this whole section of the Torah, Leviticus chapter 18, is all about sexual boundaries. What is permitted to me sexually and what is not permitted to me sexually. This is my sister, not my wife. This is my father's sister, and therefore can't be my wife. This is my brother's wife, and therefore can't be my wife. This is a man and not a woman, and therefore isn't a procreation type relationship, and therefore not part of the ability to have a sexual relationship with, etc. All these things demarcate the different types of relationships. And if someone is a far enough relative and they're not married to somebody else, then they can be wife material. That can be somebody that you can have a relationship with on a sexual level, and therefore build a family with. So it's demarcating these different categories of people, and therefore the kinds of relationships that you can have with them, and putting boundaries around them. And if you want to build a sustainable society, you need clear boundaries with regard to private property and public property. You need boundaries about who you can marry, who you can build a family with. And that has much larger implications as well, because if you're only building families with your close relatives, then you're just building clans and you don't end up with a larger society either. So these demarcation of relationships are really important. What can I do and what I cannot do? What is mine and what's not mine? What is a wife type relationship and what is a sister or a mother or a grandmother or an aunt type relationship? And these should be really clear if you want to build a sustainable society. What you find today with postmodernism is the blurring of all these boundaries. Just take, for example, what's happening on campuses today in America. You're finding people taking over private property. They're putting their encampments in places which are not theirs. This isn't yours. You can't make an encampment there. Yes, you've got arguments, you've got protests, etc., but you can't just take over somebody else's property. That's not your property. That is somebody else's property. You can't just break into a building and storm it. That's not yours. You can't do that. It's interesting that they make the argument that this is similar to January 6th, but I would argue that the people in January 6th, where what they did was wrong and should never have been done, what they broke into was the people's house. One might argue that that belongs to everybody. What the students are doing here in the left is they're totally disregarding the boundaries of property in general. They're saying it's all mine. There is no separation between my property and your property. They're saying it's all my property because it's all mine. And what's yours is mine. And then when it comes to sexuality, again, one finds on the left blurring of all the boundaries. A man is not merely a man. It could be a woman, and a woman is not really a woman. And just because you have male genitalia, that doesn't make you a man, and you could be a woman. And just because you're born female doesn't make you female. Just because you're born male doesn't make you male. You could be a woman as well. Blurring the boundaries. All this, his, her, they, them, this is all the blurring of the boundaries. And if you want a sustainable society, you can't blur the boundaries. That is what God is saying. And we have lived experience of this in the West. We know that families are the bedrocks of society. They're the building blocks of society. We know that the ability to have private property, that my property is mine and yours is yours, and having rules around that, that is fundamental to a prosperous society. We know that communism doesn't work. We know that societies built on communes don't work. We know that from our lived experience, all those countries which did that, they ended up failing. Now that type of ideology is trying to come in through the back door. We no longer have to go and say that the only reason why we should keep these rules is because God told us. Back then, when no one lived those rules, it had to come from the authority of God. But now we actually have lived experience which tells us that these rules are important. And we should stand up and argue for these rules, not just because God told us them, but also because our lived experience tells us that this is a better way to live. This is a more sustainable way to live. And we should lean in on that knowledge that we have garnered through those lived experiences and make those full-throated arguments and counter this postmodern extreme ideology, which is trying to tell us other. Again, not just because God told us, but because we actually now have the lived experience and the knowledge gained through that lived experience to tell us and teach us this. So this has been Levi Brackman with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today, Torah Portion Uncensored series about Leviticus chapter 18, Vayikra, Perek Yudches, all about the forbidden marriages, the arayos, and how it relates to our life today. I hope that this has been valuable to you. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.